Every time you swallow your anger instead of expressing it, your heart registers the decision before your conscious mind has even finished making it. This is not poetic language, it is measurable cardiovascular physiology, and it begins at the level of a single, overworked muscle. Let's go straight to the cellular level, because this is where the real story begins. When anger arises, your sympathetic nervous system triggers a release of catecholamines, primarily adrenaline and noradrenaline, which cause your heart muscle cells to contract more forcefully and your coronary arteries to constrict. This is the body's ancient preparation for confrontation. But when that anger is suppressed rather than expressed or released, something unusual happens. Research referenced by the American Heart Association has found that suppressed anger, sometimes called anger in coping, is associated with sustained elevation in blood pressure and increased arterial stiffness over time, distinct from anger that is expressed and then resolved. Your heart is not simply reacting to the emotion, it is absorbing the cost of holding it. This is the catecholamine suppression cascade, and it is one of the more precisely studied intersections of emotion and cardiovascular health. This goes far deeper than anything you'll hear in a routine doctor's visit or read in a wellness article telling you to let it go. Your doctor does not have time in a 7-minute appointment to walk you through arterial endothelial function. A magazine will tell you that bottling up emotions is unhealthy. Almost nothing will tell you, mechanism by mechanism, what is actually happening inside your chest in the moments you choose silence over expression. So let's go there. The first mechanism is endothelial dysfunction. The endothelium is the thin layer of cells lining your blood vessels, and it is responsible for releasing nitric oxide, a molecule that allows vessels to relax and widen. Studies referenced by Harvard Medical School have found that chronic anger suppression is associated with impaired endothelial function, meaning the blood vessels become less able to relax properly, contributing over time to elevated blood pressure and increased cardiovascular strain. The second mechanism is allostatic load on the cardiovascular system. Each time anger is suppressed rather than processed, a small surge of catecholamines and cortisol moves through the bloodstream regardless, because the physiological response has already begun before the conscious decision to suppress is made. Over months and years, this repeated, unresolved activation accumulates, and research published in the Journal of the American Heart Association has linked this cumulative load to increased risk of hypertension and, in some studies, coronary artery disease. The third mechanism involves the vagus nerve, the same nerve responsible for regulating your heart rate after stress. Suppressing anger appears to interfere with healthy vagal recovery, the process by which your heart rate returns to baseline after emotional activation. Lower heart rate variability, a marker of vagal health, has been observed in individuals who habitually suppress anger compared to those who express it in healthier, more regulated ways. The fourth mechanism is platelet activation. Sustained anger, whether expressed or suppressed, triggers a measurable increase in platelet reactivity, the tendency of blood cells to clump together. Suppressed anger appears to prolong this activation longer than anger that is acknowledged and processed, according to cardiovascular research referenced by the American Heart Association, which is part of why chronic suppressed anger has been studied as a contributing factor in clot-related cardiac events. The fifth mechanism is muscular and respiratory. Suppressed anger is frequently accompanied by shallow breathing and chronic tension in the chest and jaw, a pattern that further restricts healthy vagal tone and reduces the body's capacity to physiologically discharge the stress response that anger initiates. The anger does not disappear when it is suppressed. It is rerouted into the body, held in tissue, rather than released through expression or resolution. Let me try to make this invisible process visible. Imagine your cardiovascular system as a pressure cooker with a release valve. Healthy, expressed, and resolved anger is like briefly opening that valve, letting pressure escape in a controlled way before sealing back up. Suppressed anger is like holding the valve shut by hand, again and again, every single day. The pressure inside does not vanish. It simply keeps building, quietly, against a system that was never designed to hold it indefinitely. Eventually, something in that system bears the cost of all that unreleased pressure, and far too often, that something is the heart itself. This matters profoundly after the age of 55. Arterial walls naturally lose some elasticity with age, a process called arterial stiffening, which means the cardiovascular system already has less flexibility to absorb stress-related strain than it did decades earlier. Research referenced by the American Heart Association has shown that the cardiovascular consequences of chronic suppressed anger become more pronounced in older adults, partly because age-related arterial stiffness compounds the endothelial dysfunction we discussed earlier. This is part of why learning to process anger in healthier ways is not simply an emotional skill at this stage of life. It is a measurable physiological form of cardiovascular self-care. So what do you actually do with this? Here is the simple, almost embarrassingly practical insight buried inside all of this complex biology. Naming the emotion out loud, even quietly to yourself, "I am angry right now," has been shown in psychological research to reduce amygdala activation and begin lowering the physiological intensity of the anger response within moments. This process is sometimes called affect labeling. It does not require confrontation. It does not require expressing anger to another person. It simply requires acknowledging, internally and honestly, that the anger exists, rather than immediately suppressing it before it has even been recognized. But here is what almost nobody tells you, and it reframes this entire conversation. Anger itself is not the villain in this story. Anger is simply a signal, a biological alert that a boundary has been crossed or a need is not being met. The cardiovascular cost we have been discussing is not the cost of feeling anger. It is the cost of repeatedly silencing the signal without ever addressing what it was pointing to. Your heart is not being punished for having emotions. It is absorbing the unresolved weight of needs that were never voiced. There is a related pattern worth understanding here as well, sometimes referred to in research as type D personality, a tendency toward both negative emotionality and social inhibition, meaning a person experiences distress but consistently avoids expressing it to others for fear of disapproval or conflict. Studies referenced by cardiovascular researchers have found this combination, distress paired with chronic suppression, associated with significantly elevated cardiac risk compared to either trait alone. It is not the anger, and it is not the introversion individually that carries the risk. It is the specific combination of feeling deeply and expressing almost nothing. There is also a generational layer to this story that is worth naming directly, particularly for an audience raised in decades when emotional restraint, especially around anger, was often taught as a virtue rather than examined as a health behavior. Many people now in their 60s and 70s were raised with the explicit instruction to keep their temper, to not make a scene, to handle things quietly. That cultural training does not simply disappear with new information. It often takes active, repeated practice to begin recognizing anger as it arises, rather than suppressing it reflexively out of decades of ingrained habit. This is not a character flaw, it is a learned pattern, and learned patterns, unlike arterial tissue, remain changeable at any age. There is one more mechanism worth understanding, because it connects everything we have discussed back to daily life. Researchers studying expressive writing, the practice of writing privately about emotional experiences for even a few minutes a day, have found measurable reductions in physiological stress markers, including blood pressure, among people who practice it consistently. This appears to work through a similar mechanism to affect labeling. It gives the suppressed signal somewhere to go, a controlled release valve that does not require confrontation, conflict, or even another person being present at all. For someone who has spent decades suppressing anger out of habit, this kind of private processing can be a genuinely accessible starting point, requiring nothing more than a notebook and a few honest minutes. If you zoom out far enough, something quite remarkable comes into focus. The very mechanism that allowed your ancestors to survive confrontation, that rapid mobilization of catecholamines and cardiovascular readiness, is the same mechanism running through your chest today, largely unchanged by evolution, now navigating traffic, difficult conversations, and family disagreements instead of physical threats. Your heart has not malfunctioned by responding this way. It is running extraordinarily old software in a world it was never built for. And the chronic suppression so many of us were taught to value is, in many cases, simply a mismatch between ancient biology and modern expectations of politeness. Understanding that mismatch is the first step toward working with your body instead of quietly against it. What we've covered today is drawn from peer-reviewed cardiovascular and psychological research and is intended for educational purposes. It is not a substitute for medical advice. If you are experiencing chest pain, palpitations, or significant blood pressure changes, please seek medical attention, since these symptoms always deserve direct evaluation by a healthcare professional. If this finally explained the tightness you felt in your chest after holding your tongue one too many times, send this to someone who has spent a lifetime keeping the peace at their own expense. Their heart has been listening the whole time. Next time, we're going somewhere even more unexpected. What actually happens inside your body in the exact moment you finally feel safe enough to cry, and why that release may be doing more for your heart than you ever realized.